Nicole VanderHeyden woke up to the soft sound of her youngest child stirring in the next room. She stretched, glanced at the clock, 7:02 a.m., and felt the familiar pull of another busy day ahead. The May sun streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the bedroom. From the kitchen, she could hear Detrie humming along to the radio, a rare sign of cheerfulness in recent weeks. For a brief moment, everything seemed peaceful. But deep down, Nicole couldn't shake the lingering tension that had become a constant in their lives. "Mama!" her daughter called, breaking the silence. Nicole quickly got up and padded to the children's room. The sight of her two youngest sharing a giggle over a stuffed bear brought a smile to her face. This was her haven, her children, their joy, their innocence. She bent down to kiss her daughter's forehead. "Ready for pancakes?" she asked with mock enthusiasm, knowing the answer was always yes. Downstairs, Douglas was already at the stove. The smell of sizzling bacon mingled with freshly brewed coffee. "Morning," Nicole greeted, her tone light but guarded. "Morning," Douglas replied without looking up. His shoulders seemed tense, though his actions were deliberate and calm. Nicole moved to help, grabbing plates and setting them on the counter. It felt almost like teamwork, almost. As they sat for breakfast, Douglas broke the silence. "What's the plan for today?" His question sounded casual, but Nicole noticed the edge in his voice. She hesitated. "I have that concert tonight with the girls," she said, carefully avoiding his gaze. His fork paused midair. "The concert?" he repeated, his tone sharpening. "Didn't we agree you'd stay home this weekend?" Nicole bit her lip, willing herself to remain calm. "We talked about this, Doug. The tickets were a gift from Sarah months ago. I'll just be out for a few hours." She tried to keep her voice steady, but she could feel the tension mounting. Douglas put his fork down with a little more force than necessary. "I don't like it," he said flatly. "You don't know what kind of people will be there." The conversation lingered in the air like a bad smell. Nicole focused on finishing her coffee, unwilling to let this escalate further. The children's chatter offered a temporary distraction, their laughter a reminder of why she endured these moments. Later, as Nicole tidied up the kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sarah. "Excited for tonight. Don't let Doug ruin your mood, okay?" Nicole sighed, glancing over her shoulder to make sure Douglas wasn't watching. She typed back quickly. "I'll be fine. Can't wait to see you." But fine was far from what she felt. As Douglas walked past her, his gaze lingered on her phone screen just long enough to make her uncomfortable. Nicole put the phone face down and busied herself with cleaning. Her heart raced. She hated the feeling of being watched, of being judged for every decision. The day wore on uneventfully, though the undercurrent of tension remained. Nicole took the kids to the park in the afternoon, enjoying their giggles as they climbed and slid. It was a brief reprieve, a chance to clear her head before the evening. Back home, Douglas sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. His mood seemed to have improved slightly, though Nicole knew better than to trust it completely. "Dinner before you go?" he asked, his tone casual but loaded. She nodded, hoping to avoid another confrontation. As the clock ticked closer to evening, Nicole couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. She picked out her outfit for the concert, a simple blouse and jeans, nothing too flashy, nothing that would spark an argument. Yet, when Douglas saw her come down the stairs, his eyes narrowed. "That's what you're wearing?" he asked, his voice laced with disapproval. Nicole's hand gripped the banister tighter, her stomach knotting. "Yes," she replied firmly. "Why?" Douglas shrugged, his jaw tightening. "Just seems like you're trying to get attention," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for her to hear. Nicole chose not to engage, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face, and she took a deep breath. It was just one night out with friends, she reminded herself. One night to feel like herself again. But as she started the car, Nicole couldn't ignore the weight of Douglas's glare through the window. The late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor as Nicole scrolled through her phone. A notification popped up, a text from Sarah. "All set for tonight? Can't wait to dance our stress away." Nicole smiled faintly, her fingers hovering over the reply. She was excited about the concert but hesitant, knowing it would likely cause another argument with Douglas. The sound of the door opening made her glance up. Douglas entered, tossing his keys onto the counter. "Hey," he said, his tone neutral. almost too casual. Nicole felt her pulse quicken. She decided to rip the Band-Aid off. Sarah just texted, she's picking me up at 7 for the concert. Douglas froze mid-step. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable at first. The concert? He asked slowly. You're still going? Nicole nodded, trying to keep her tone even. Of course. We've been planning this for months, Doug. It's just a girls' night out. His jaw tightened. You know I don't like the idea of you being around. Those kinds of people. His voice grew sharp, the casualness from moments ago evaporating. You have no idea who might be there. It's a concert, Doug, Nicole said, exasperation creeping into her voice. It's not like I'm going alone. Douglas leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. And what am I supposed to do? Sit here and babysit while you're out having fun? Nicole bristled. They're your kids too, and it's one night. Why are you making this a big deal? His gaze darkened. Because I don't trust it. You, out there, dressed up, drinking, people will get the wrong idea. Her hands tightened around her phone. The accusation in his voice was unmistakable. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. Doug, I need this. I haven't had a night to myself in months. It's not about you. His laugh was humorless, cutting. Not about me? That's funny, because it feels like you're doing everything to push me away. Nicole felt the sting of his words, but refused to let them land fully. I'm going, Doug, she said firmly. I've already told Sarah. The tension hung heavy between them, a silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Without another word, Douglas pushed off the counter and left the room. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed like thunder in her ears. Later, as Nicole selected an outfit for the evening, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered from their conversation. She chose something simple, jeans and a blouse, avoiding anything that might provoke another comment from Douglas. Yet, as she caught her reflection in the mirror, she couldn't help but notice the tension in her own eyes. Downstairs, Douglas was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone with a blank expression. Sarah's here, Nicole called out as headlights flashed through the window. He didn't respond. She hesitated for a moment, waiting for him to say something, anything. But there was only silence. Doug? She tried again. His head tilted slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the screen. Finally, he muttered, just be careful. Nicole swallowed the lump in her throat. I will, she said softly, before stepping out into the crisp evening air. Sarah greeted her with a warm smile as Nicole climbed into the car, but the unease from her conversation with Douglas clung to her like a shadow. As they drove away, Nicole glanced back at the house. Through the window, she could see Douglas still seated on the couch, his silhouette illuminated by the glow of his phone. A chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't quite place why. She shook it off, turning her attention to Sarah, who was chatting excitedly about the night ahead. Nicole forced a smile and nodded along, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't escape the feeling that tonight was going to change everything. The bar buzzed with life, its dim lighting and loud music creating an almost electric atmosphere. Nicole stepped inside with Sarah, the two women greeted by a small group of their friends who had already claimed a corner booth. Laughter and chatter filled the space, the kind of carefree energy Nicole desperately needed tonight. Nicole felt herself relax as the evening went on, letting the weight of the tension with Douglas fall away, at least for a while. The group shared drinks and stories, their laughter occasionally erupting louder than the music. For the first time in weeks, Nicole felt like herself again. But as the night deepened, Nicole's phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening. It was Douglas. The message read, "Where are you?" Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before she typed back, "At the bar with Sarah and the group. We just got here." "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing the change in Nicole's demeanor. Nicole nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just Doug checking in," she said, tucking her phone into her purse. Across the room, someone entered, and Nicole's gaze drifted toward the door. Her breath caught. It was Douglas. His figure loomed in the entrance, scanning the room until his eyes landed on her. Nicole's heart sank as he walked toward their table, his expression unreadable. "Doug," Nicole said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Her tone was calm, but there was an edge of discomfort. Douglas shrugged, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I thought I'd stop by, make sure everything's fine," he said casually, though his tone betrayed the tension bubbling beneath. The group around Nicole fell silent, the awkwardness thickening as Douglas stood there. Sarah exchanged a glance with another friend, but no one said anything. Nicole forced a smile, trying to keep things light. Well, as you can see, we're all good here, she said, gesturing to the table. You didn't have to come all the way. Douglas didn't sit but lingered close, his eyes scanning the group before settling back on Nicole. I'll grab a drink, he said, turning abruptly toward the bar. The tension didn't ease as Douglas moved away. Nicole exhaled slowly, her friends looking at her with a mix of concern and discomfort. He's just protective, Nicole muttered, though the explanation felt hollow even to her. Sarah leaned in, her voice low. Nicole, you don't have to put up with this. I'm fine, Nicole said quickly, hoping to end the conversation. But her eyes betrayed her unease, darting toward Douglas, who was now at the bar, his gaze flicking back toward their table. His presence hung over her like a storm cloud, impossible to ignore. Minutes later, Douglas returned with a drink in hand, sliding into an empty seat next to Nicole. His proximity made her stiffen. The group tried to resume their conversation, but Douglas's interjections were clipped, his demeanor making it clear he wasn't there to socialize. When one of the male friends in the group made a light-hearted comment to Nicole, Douglas's expression darkened. You're awfully familiar, aren't you? He said, his tone sharp. The table fell silent again, the air thick with discomfort. Nicole turned to him, her voice low but firm. Doug, stop. This isn't the time or place. Isn't it? Douglas shot back, his voice rising slightly. I think it's the perfect place to figure out what's really going on, Sarah interjected, her voice calm but strong. Doug, I think you should leave. This isn't helping anyone. Douglas's eyes flashed toward Sarah, his jaw tightening. I'm not the one causing problems here, he said coldly, before standing abruptly. He leaned toward Nicole, his words a low growl. Don't make me regret trusting you. And with that, he walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Nicole felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. Her friends murmured their concern, but she waved them off, trying to salvage what was left of the evening. But deep down, Nicole knew the night wasn't over. Not really. Douglas's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder that the tension between them was far from resolved. The cool night air wrapped around Nicole as she stepped out of the bar, her breath forming faint clouds in the dim light. The muffled sounds of laughter and music faded behind her as the door swung shut. She pulled her jacket tighter, fumbling with her phone to call Sarah, but no answer. She sighed, muttering to herself, Guess I'll just walk for a bit. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she headed down the quiet street, the occasional car passing by with headlights cutting through the darkness. The uneasy feeling from earlier lingered, tightening in her chest. Nicole shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. Douglas's words echoed in her mind. Don't make me regret trusting you. She shivered, but it wasn't from the cold. Behind her, the sound of footsteps broke the silence. Nicole froze, her heart racing. She turned, but the street was empty, except for the soft glow of a distant lamppost. Calm down, she whispered to herself, forcing a laugh. It's just your imagination. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting toward the shadows stretching across the sidewalk. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. It was a text from Sarah. Where are you? Doug left and I can't find you. Nicole hesitated before replying. I'm heading home. Just needed some air. She didn't mention the unease creeping through her veins. As she approached a side street leading to a wooded area, a car slowed beside her. The driver's face was obscured by shadows, but the window rolled down. Need a ride? A man's voice called out, low and unfamiliar. Nicole's stomach churned. No thanks, she said, forcing a polite tone and walking faster. The car lingered for a moment before accelerating, its red taillights disappearing into the night. Nicole exhaled shakily, her steps hurried now. The woods loomed ahead, dark and silent, but it was the shortest route home. She glanced back again, half expecting to see the car returning or another shadowy figure, but the street remained empty. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Douglas. Where are you? Come home now. Nicole stared at the message, her fingers trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she pressed her phone tightly in her hand and entered the wooded path. The faint sound of her footsteps on gravel seemed deafening in the stillness. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind her. Nicole froze, turning quickly. Hello? She called, her voice breaking slightly. There was no reply. Her breathing quickened as she scanned the trees, shadows playing tricks on her eyes. The silence was oppressive, the kind that made every noise feel like a threat. Her phone slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud on the ground. Nicole bent down quickly to pick it up, her hands fumbling. When she stood again, the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She felt it. Someone was watching her. Nicole's instinct took over. She started running, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she sprinted down the path. Her phone vibrated in her hand, but she didn't dare stop to look. All she could think was to get away, to reach the lights of home, to be safe. When she burst out of the woods onto a familiar street, she slowed, gasping for air. She looked back, but there was no one, just the quiet darkness of the path she'd left behind. Relief washed over her briefly, but the dread hadn't completely lifted. Nicole clutched her phone tightly, the screen lighting up again with another text. "Nicole, answer me. Where are you?" This time she didn't respond. She glanced toward the direction of her house, the street feeling eerily quiet, and began walking quickly. It was the last time anyone would see Nicole alive. The morning sun rose over the rolling fields of Ledgeview, casting golden hues across the dewy grass. A farmer drove his tractor along the edge of his property, preparing for another day of routine work. As he turned the corner of a dirt path near the far side of the field, something unusual caught his eye. A flash of pale fabric against the deep green. He slowed the tractor, squinting toward the ground. Curiosity turned to dread as he stepped closer. His hand instinctively covered his mouth as the horrifying sight became clear. It was a woman, her body twisted unnaturally, hair matted with dirt and blood. She was motionless. The farmer stumbled back, pulling out his phone with trembling hands to call 911. "There's a body," he stammered, his voice shaking. "In my field, I think she's dead." Within minutes, police vehicles arrived, their sirens piercing the otherwise serene morning. Officers cordoned off the area, securing the field as investigators began their grim work. The body was identified as Nicole VanderHeyden. She was lying face down, her clothes torn, her skin marked with bruises and cuts. It was immediately clear that this was no accident. This was murder. Detective Halverson surveyed the scene, his face grim. "Whoever did this wanted her to suffer," he muttered to a colleague. Nearby, a shoe, Nicole's, was found several yards away, suggesting she had tried to flee her attacker. The area was combed for evidence, every piece carefully cataloged. As the news broke, neighbors began gathering near the edges of the crime scene, their faces etched with shock and horror. "She was such a sweet girl," one elderly woman whispered to a reporter. "Always so kind, so full of life. How could someone do this?" Back at the station, Nicole's family was informed of her death. Her mother broke down in tears, clutching a framed photo of Nicole. "She didn't deserve this," she cried. "She had so much to live for." Douglas Detrie was brought in for questioning that same afternoon. His demeanor was unnervingly calm, though he insisted he had nothing to do with Nicole's disappearance. "I went to bed," he told detectives. "When I woke up, she was gone. I thought maybe she stayed at Sarah's." But detectives weren't convinced. Douglas's timeline didn't add up, and his lack of visible emotion struck them as odd. "We'll need to check your phone records and GPS," Detective Halverson said, watching for any flicker of hesitation. Douglas nodded, his expression unreadable. "Do whatever you need to do. I loved her. I'd never hurt her." As investigators combed through Douglas's phone data, they discovered something troubling. His GPS location placed him near the field where Nicole's body was found at an incriminating time, shortly after she was last seen alive. Detectives also found traces of blood on Douglas's shoes, which he explained away as an old stain. "It's nothing," he said dismissively. "I've had those shoes for years." The physical evidence told a different story. Forensic analysts confirmed that the blood on Douglas's shoes matched Nicole's DNA. Suddenly, his calm facade began to crack. His responses to questioning became more defensive, his tone sharp and clipped. "Are you seriously accusing me?" he snapped during one session. "I loved her." While the case against Douglas was building, investigators hit a perplexing snag. Another DNA sample, unidentified, was found on Nicole's clothing. This discovery introduced the possibility of a second person being involved, sending the investigation into a spiral of new questions. Meanwhile, the town of Ledgeview reeled from the tragedy. Candlelight vigils were held in Nicole's honor, her friends and family speaking through tears about her warmth, her humor, and her love for her children. "She was the best mom," one of her friends said, her voice cracking. "They've lost everything now." As the day closed, Detective Halverson sat in his office, staring at the mounting evidence on his desk. The case was far from over, but one thing was certain: justice for Nicole would not come easily. Detective Halverson leaned back in his chair, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the quiet room. On his desk, the case file on Nicole VanderHeyden lay open, filled with photos, reports, and timelines. The evidence against Douglas Detrie was damning, but something gnawed at him. A small, nagging detail. The unknown DNA found on Nicole's clothing opened a possibility they couldn't ignore. There might be another suspect. That morning, a breakthrough came. A witness stepped forward, a bartender who had been working the night Nicole disappeared. He recalled seeing a man at the bar who had been overly friendly with Nicole, offering to buy her drinks and lingering around her group. "He seemed pushy," the bartender said. "When she left, I think he followed her out." The man in question, Kevin Kane, was quickly identified. He was a regular at the bar, known for his flirtatious and sometimes aggressive behavior toward women. Kane had left the bar around the same time as Nicole and was reportedly seen driving in the direction of her neighborhood. Detectives brought him in for questioning. Sitting across from Halverson in the interrogation room, Kane appeared calm but visibly annoyed. "Look, I didn't do anything," he said, his arms crossed defensively. "I talked to her, sure, but that's it. I left before she did." "Did you follow Nicole out of the bar?" Halverson asked, his voice steady but probing. Kane scoffed. "No, why would I? She wasn't interested, so I moved on." Halverson slid a photo of Nicole across the table, her smile frozen in a moment of happiness. "You're saying you had no further contact with her that night?" Kane hesitated, his eyes darting to the photo before meeting Halverson's gaze. "No, I didn't. I went home. Ask anyone." But Kane's alibi didn't hold up. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed his car heading toward the area where Nicole's body was later found. The timeline aligned too perfectly to ignore. When confronted with this evidence, Kane's demeanor shifted. "Okay, so I drove that way. Big deal, I didn't hurt her." Detectives searched Kane's vehicle and home, looking for anything that might link him to Nicole. They found nothing definitive. No blood, no clothing fibers, no connection. But his evasive answers and shaky alibi made him a prime suspect. The investigation turned toward matching the unknown DNA to Kane. For days, the forensic lab worked tirelessly, comparing Kane's DNA to the sample from Nicole's clothing. When the results came in, the match wasn't there. Kane was officially cleared as a suspect, leaving detectives back at square one. Meanwhile, Douglas Detrie's behavior remained under scrutiny. While police pursued leads on Kane, Douglas's phone records revealed something chilling. Several calls made to Nicole's phone in the early hours of the morning after she disappeared. None of the calls were answered, but the timing suggested desperation or guilt. Detective Halverson replayed Douglas's initial interview in his mind, recalling the calmness with which he spoke about Nicole's absence. It felt rehearsed, almost too calculated. And now, with Kane ruled out, the focus shifted back to the person closest to Nicole, her partner. The pressure on Douglas began to mount. Friends and family of Nicole shared more stories of his controlling behavior, painting a picture of a man who struggled with jealousy and anger. One friend recounted a chilling conversation she'd had with Nicole weeks before her death. "She told me Doug had a temper," the friend said, tears welling in her eyes. "She was scared of what he might do." Despite the mounting evidence, Douglas maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he insisted during another round of questioning. "You're wasting time looking at me when the real killer is still out there." But the investigators weren't convinced. The blood on Douglas's shoes and the GPS placing him near the crime scene were facts he couldn't explain away. And while Kane had been a distraction, his elimination as a suspect only solidified the case against Douglas. As the pieces began to fall into place, Detective Halverson felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. Nicole's story deserved justice, and the evidence was leading him closer to uncovering the truth. Detective Halverson sat at his desk, staring at the board filled with photos and timelines. The evidence against Douglas was compelling, but the unanswered question of the unknown DNA kept nagging at him. The case felt tangled, like a puzzle with one crucial piece missing. As he sipped his coffee, a knock at the door broke his concentration. "Detective," Officer Martinez said, stepping in, "we've got something." Halverson followed Martinez to the evidence lab where the forensic team had new information. "We ran the unknown DNA through the national database again," the forensic analyst said, handing over a report. "We found a familial match." Halverson's pulse quickened. "Who?" "It's not a direct match, but close enough to trace. The DNA belongs to someone related to a man named Ryan Hill. He's got priors, assault, burglary, you name it. He lives in the area." The name didn't ring any bells, but Halverson knew it was worth exploring. Hill's record showed a pattern of violent behavior, and his last known address was only a few miles from where Nicole's body was found. By afternoon, Halverson and Martinez were knocking on Hill's door. The man who answered was in his mid-30s, his appearance unkempt, his demeanor guarded. "What's this about?" Hill asked, leaning against the doorframe. "We're investigating the murder of Nicole VanderHeyden," Halverson said evenly. "Your name came up." Hill's eyes narrowed. "I don't know who that is." "Really?" Martinez interjected. "Because your DNA was found on her clothing." Hill's jaw tightened, but he didn't immediately respond. "Look, I don't know her," he said after a moment. "I've never even heard of her." "Then how do you explain the DNA?" Halverson pressed. "We can place you in the vicinity of the crime scene." Hill shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the detectives. I don't know, maybe I was at the same bar or something." "Or something," Halverson's tone sharpened. "That's not going to cut it, Hill." The tension in the room thickened as the detectives leaned in, their questions relentless. Hill's evasive answers only deepened their suspicions, but without more concrete evidence, they couldn't hold him for long. Back at the station, Halverson couldn't shake the feeling that Hill was involved, if not directly, then tangentially. The unknown DNA had to mean something. He ordered a deeper dive into Hill's recent activities and connections, hoping to uncover a link. That night, Halverson reviewed the case again. The timeline, the physical evidence, Douglas's behavior, it all pointed in one direction. Yet Hill's sudden appearance in the investigation complicated the picture. Could there have been more than one person involved? Was Hill an accomplice or just an unlucky bystander? The pressure to solve the case was mounting. The community was demanding answers, and Nicole's family was growing impatient for justice. "We just want to know who did this," Nicole's mother had said tearfully during a press conference. She didn't deserve to be left out there like that. Halverson understood their pain, but he also knew the risks of rushing to conclusions. They needed to be thorough, to be certain. The truth was within reach, but the path to it was anything but straightforward. The next morning, another lead emerged. A neighbor of Hill's came forward, claiming to have seen his car parked near the woods on the night Nicole disappeared. The statement added weight to the suspicion surrounding Hill, but it also raised a chilling possibility. If Hill was involved, how many others were too? Halverson stared at the evidence board once more, the pieces beginning to form a clearer picture. This wasn't just a case of a jealous lover. It was something darker, something far more complex. Detective Halverson stood in the dimly lit conference room, the whiteboard behind him filled with names, photos, and connecting lines. The case had grown more intricate, with each new piece of evidence both clarifying and complicating the story. Ryan Hill's evasive answers and the unknown DNA suggested a broader web, but the timeline and physical evidence still pointed firmly at Douglas Detrie. Halverson knew it was time to tighten the net. The forensic lab delivered another breakthrough that morning. The trace amounts of soil found on Douglas's shoes matched the unique composition of the field where Nicole's body was discovered. Halverson stared at the report, his jaw tightening. "That's it," he muttered. "That's the connection we needed." Meanwhile, Hill's neighbor provided more details about the suspicious activity on the night of Nicole's disappearance. "I saw Ryan's car parked near the woods," she told officers. "But there was someone else, another man. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was tall, broad-shouldered. It wasn't Ryan." This testimony added a chilling new layer to the case. Could Douglas and Hill have been working together, or was this an entirely separate figure? The idea of multiple perpetrators sent ripples through the investigation team. Douglas, still claiming innocence, was brought in for another round of questioning. His demeanor had shifted. Gone was the calm composure of earlier interviews. Now he seemed agitated, his answers clipped. "I already told you everything," he snapped, slamming his hands on the table. "I didn't kill her." Halverson leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then how do you explain the soil on your shoes, the GPS data putting you near the field, the blood we found?" Douglas hesitated, his jaw clenching. "I was looking for her. I went out that night to find her, but she was already gone when I got there." "Why didn't you tell us this earlier?" Halverson asked sharply. "Why lie about being home all night?" "I panicked," Douglas shouted, his voice cracking. "I didn't know what to say. I knew how it would look." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Halverson exchanged a glance with Martinez, both knowing this was far from the full story. Later that afternoon, officers executed a search warrant at Hill's home. Among his belongings, they found a pair of work boots with what appeared to be dried mud. Forensic testing confirmed the soil matched the field where Nicole was found. However, Hill's DNA still didn't match the unknown sample on Nicole's clothing. The team was running out of plausible explanations. Halverson gathered his team for a late-night briefing. "We have two suspects," he said, pacing the room, "both with ties to the scene, but no clear evidence linking them to each other. We need to figure out who that second man is, or if one of them is lying about their involvement." The tension was palpable. Every officer in the room knew the clock was ticking. The media had picked up on the twists in the investigation, with headlines speculating about a potential accomplice. Nicole's family pleaded for answers during a televised interview, their grief raw and unfiltered. "She was a beautiful soul," her mother said through tears. "All we want is justice for her children." As Halverson left the station that night, his phone buzzed with a call. "Detective," the forensic analyst's voice came through. "We ran another comparison on the DNA. We have a new match. It's closer than we thought." Halverson stopped in his tracks, his heartbeat quickening. "Who is it?" The analyst hesitated. "It's a partial match to Douglas, likely a close male relative." The revelation hit Halverson like a freight train. "Get me the details," he said, his voice firm. "And fast." The case had just taken a dramatic turn, and Halverson knew one thing for certain: they were closer than ever to uncovering the truth. Detective Halverson sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his fingers tapping against the table as he reviewed the latest forensic report. The partial DNA match had been verified. The evidence now pointed squarely at Douglas Detrie. It wasn't just circumstantial anymore. It was damning. Across the hall, Douglas was sitting in a holding cell, his head in his hands. He had been brought in earlier that morning, his protests of innocence louder and more frantic than ever. "You're making a mistake," he had shouted as officers escorted him into the station. "I didn't do this." But Halverson wasn't swayed. The combination of GPS data, soil analysis, blood evidence, and now the partial DNA match painted a clear picture. The truth was closing in, and Douglas was running out of places to hide. The news of his arrest broke quickly. Reporters swarmed outside the police station, cameras flashing as journalists clamored for statements. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Nicole's family had been informed of the arrest, their emotions a mixture of relief and anguish. Her mother's voice cracked as she spoke to reporters later that afternoon. "We've waited so long for this," she said, clutching a photo of Nicole, "but nothing will bring her back." In the community, reactions were swift and intense. Some were shocked that someone so close to Nicole could be responsible for such a heinous act. Others weren't surprised at all, citing rumors of Douglas's controlling behavior and volatile temper. At the local diner, patrons whispered about the case, their voices hushed but filled with judgment. "I always thought there was something off about him," one woman murmured. "He had that look, you know?" Back at the station, the interrogation began. Halverson entered the room, his expression unreadable. Douglas looked up, his eyes red and weary. "You're making a mistake," he repeated, his voice hoarse. "I loved her." Halverson sat down, sliding the forensic report across the table. "The evidence says otherwise, Doug. GPS puts you at the field. The soil on your shoes matches the scene. Her blood is on your shoes. And now the DNA, it's all pointing to you." Douglas's hands clenched into fists. "I went out there looking for her. I told you that. I found her stuff, but I didn't touch her. Someone else did this." "Then explain the timeline," Halverson said, leaning in. "Why didn't you call the police? Why did you lie about being home all night?" "I panicked," Douglas shouted, his voice breaking. "I knew you'd think it was me. I didn't know what to do." Halverson watched him carefully, noting the desperation in his voice. He knew this wasn't a confession, but it wasn't the behavior of an innocent man either. "Tell me about the DNA, Doug. A partial match to you. That means a close relative. Who else was involved?" Douglas's face fell, his expression shifting from defiance to something closer to fear. He shook his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Halverson wasn't convinced. "We're running out of time, Doug. If someone else was involved, now's the time to come clean." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force. Douglas stared at the table, his breathing heavy, but he said nothing more. Outside, the community's reaction continued to unfold. A candlelight vigil was held in Nicole's honor that evening, attended by dozens of friends, family members, and neighbors. The flickering lights illuminated tear-streaked faces as they shared memories of Nicole's warmth, her laughter, and her love for her children. But even in the midst of this tribute, questions lingered. Had Douglas acted alone? Was there another piece of the puzzle still missing? As the night deepened, Halverson stood by the window of his office, looking out at the station parking lot where reporters still lingered. The case was far from over, But with Douglas in custody, they were one step closer to justice for Nicole. The courtroom buzzed with muted tension as the first day of the trial began. Journalists filled the back rows, their pens poised and cameras ready. Family members of Nicole VanderHeyden sat together, their faces somber, clutching tissues and photographs of her smiling face. At the defense table, Douglas Detrie sat with his attorney, his expression unreadable but his shoulders tense. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and the murmurs faded into silence. Judge Margaret Lawson entered, her presence commanding the room. "We are here today in the matter of the state versus Douglas Detrie," she began, her tone firm but measured. The prosecution wasted no time in setting the stage. Assistant District Attorney Emily Carter stood before the jury, her voice steady as she painted a chilling picture of the events leading up to Nicole's death. "This case," she began, "is about control, jealousy, and a tragic loss that could have been avoided. We will prove that Douglas Detrie, consumed by rage and suspicion, took Nicole's life in a brutal and calculated manner." The prosecution presented their opening evidence: the GPS data that placed Douglas near the crime scene, the soil analysis that matched his shoes to the field, and the blood evidence tying him directly to Nicole. Jurors shifted in their seats as each piece of evidence was revealed, their expressions growing graver with every detail. On the other side, the defense launched a counterattack. Douglas's lawyer, John Monroe, argued that the evidence was circumstantial and incomplete. "There is no direct proof that my client committed this crime," he asserted, pacing before the jury. "The DNA found on Nicole's clothing doesn't even match him. The prosecution wants you to ignore the gaps in their story and convict an innocent man." As the trial unfolded, testimonies from friends and family painted a stark contrast between the loving mother Nicole had been and the stormy relationship she endured with Douglas. Sarah, Nicole's closest friend, took the stand, her voice trembling as she recounted the final night she spent with Nicole. "She was tense," Sarah said, her eyes welling with tears. "She didn't say much, but I could tell she was worried. She just wanted to have a normal night." The most gut-wrenching testimony came from Nicole's mother. Standing at the witness stand, clutching a tissue, she addressed the court directly. "Nicole was my daughter," she said, her voice breaking. "She was kind, beautiful, and so full of life. Her children adored her. She didn't deserve this. No one does." But the defense worked to undermine these emotional appeals. Monroe cross-examined each witness with precision, highlighting any inconsistencies in their statements and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. "Is it possible," Monroe asked Sarah, "that Nicole's tension that night had nothing to do with my client? That she may have been concerned about someone else?" The courtroom grew heavier with each passing day, the weight of the tragedy pressing down on everyone present. The media outside latched onto every new development, broadcasting clips of the trial and interviewing legal experts about the case's complexities. One of the most pivotal moments came when forensic analyst Dr. Rachel Hensley took the stand. She detailed the evidence linking Douglas to the scene, explaining the significance of the soil on his shoes and the blood traces found. "These findings," she concluded, "are consistent with someone who was present at the location where the victim was found." Monroe pressed hard during cross-examination. "Dr. Hensley, you've stated that the DNA found on Nicole's clothing doesn't match my client. Isn't it possible that this DNA belongs to the real killer?" Dr. Hensley remained composed. "That's a possibility," she admitted, "but the physical evidence overwhelmingly ties Mr. Detrie to the scene." As the first week of the trial drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Both sides had laid the groundwork for their arguments, but the truth still seemed elusive. The jury's faces betrayed no hint of their thoughts, their expressions carefully neutral as they listened to each argument. Outside, Nicole's family huddled together, their grief raw but their determination unshaken. "We just want justice," her mother told reporters. "Justice for Nicole and for her children." Inside, Detective Halverson watched from the gallery, his mind racing through every detail of the case. The evidence was strong, but he knew the defense would exploit every weakness. The trial was only beginning, and the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. Every seat was filled, journalists with notepads poised, family members clutching tissues, and the jury seated solemnly in their box. All eyes were fixed on the judge as she entered, her expression neutral but commanding. Douglas Detrie sat at the defense table, his shoulders stiff, his hands clasped tightly. His attorney leaned in, whispering something, but Douglas's gaze remained fixed ahead. Across the room, Nicole's family sat huddled together, their faces etched with anticipation and grief. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the culmination of months of pain, doubt, and relentless pursuit of justice. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Lawson's voice broke the silence. The foreperson, a middle-aged man with glasses and a somber expression, stood. We have, Your Honor. The room collectively held its breath as the foreperson unfolded the piece of paper in his hands. The words that followed felt like they echoed. We, the jury, find the defendant, Douglas Detrie, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. Nicole's mother let out a muffled sob, clutching her daughter's photo tightly to her chest. Her father closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. Beside them, Nicole's best friend Sarah clasped her hands together, her knuckles white, as she silently mouthed, "Thank you." Douglas remained motionless at first, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. Then his jaw clenched and he shook his head slowly, muttering, "They're wrong." His lawyer placed a firm hand on his arm, but Douglas pulled away, his voice rising. "I didn't do this! You're making a mistake!" The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. Douglas slumped back into his chair, his eyes darting wildly around the room, as though searching for someone to believe him. The prosecution team exchanged quiet nods, their faces solemn but satisfied. ADA Emily Carter approached Nicole's family after the proceedings, offering a few words of comfort. "This doesn't bring her back," she said softly, "but I hope it brings you some peace." Outside, reporters clamored for statements. Nicole's mother, standing beside her husband and Sarah, spoke through tears. "We're grateful for the verdict," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "But this isn't a victory. This is closure for Nicole, for her children. She deserves so much more." The community's response was swift and overwhelming. Social media flooded with messages of support for Nicole's family and outrage at the tragedy that had unfolded. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory, the glow of hundreds of candles a testament to the lives she had touched. Inside the jail, Douglas awaited sentencing. He sat alone in his cell, his mind racing. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he maintained his innocence. His attorney had already begun drafting an appeal, but Douglas knew the odds were slim. The system had made up its mind. For Detective Halverson, the verdict was bittersweet. As he packed up the case files in his office, he felt the weight of the trial lifting, but the loss of Nicole remained heavy. He glanced at her photo one last time before placing it in the file. "Rest easy, Nicole," he murmured. "We got him." The sentencing came swiftly. Judge Lawson delivered her ruling with unwavering resolve, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Douglas showed no reaction, his gaze fixed on the floor as the words washed over him. For Nicole's family, the sentence brought the smallest measure of comfort. They had fought for her, and now justice had been served. As the court emptied, Nicole's mother lingered behind, placing a single white rose on the table where the evidence had been laid out. "You deserved better," she whispered. "I'll never stop loving you." The months following Douglas Detrie's conviction were a whirlwind of reflection and rebuilding for the VanderHeyden family and their community. For Nicole's parents, the verdict offered closure, but not the healing they so desperately craved. "Justice was served," her mother would often say, "but it doesn't erase the loss. Nothing can bring Nicole back." Determined to channel their grief into something meaningful, the family established the Nicole VanderHeyden Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about domestic violence and advocating for stronger protections for victims. The foundation's mission was clear: no one should suffer in silence, and no family should endure what they had gone through. Nicole's story spread beyond the borders of her small Wisconsin town. Media outlets picked up on the work of the foundation, highlighting her life, her tragic death, and the lessons that could be drawn from her case. The attention sparked a national conversation about the warning signs of abusive relationships and the importance of listening to victims before it was too late. Nicole's children, though too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, became a focal point of the family's efforts. Her parents, now their legal guardians, ensured that they grew up surrounded by love, often telling them stories about their mother. "She was brave, strong, and full of life," Nicole's father would say during bedtime stories, "and she loved you with all her heart." The community continued to rally around the family, holding annual candlelight vigils in Nicole's honor. These gatherings became a symbol of resilience, with hundreds of people coming together to remember her and to pledge their commitment to ending domestic violence. Nicole's light will never dim, Sarah said during one vigil, her voice steady but emotional. We carry it with us, and we'll make sure it shines brighter every year. Detective Halverson, too, found himself changed by the case. After spending months piecing together the truth of Nicole's death, he took a step back to reflect on the systemic failures that often leave victims unprotected. Nicole's case shouldn't have happened, he said during a panel discussion on law enforcement and domestic violence. We need to do better, not just as officers, but as a society. The Foundation's first major project was a hotline for individuals in abusive relationships, providing them with resources and immediate help. Within weeks of its launch, the hotline received hundreds of calls, a testament to the widespread need for such services. Nicole's family saw this as a sign that their efforts were making an impact. One particularly emotional moment came during the unveiling of a memorial bench at Nicole's favorite park, engraved with her name and the words, "Forever loved, never forgotten." The bench became a quiet place of reflection for anyone needing solace. At the ceremony, Nicole's mother placed a bouquet of white roses on the bench, her tears glistening in the afternoon sun. "This is for you, Nicole," she whispered. "Your legacy is one of love and hope." As the years passed, Nicole's story remained a powerful reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of those left behind to carry on. Her foundation grew, helping countless families and individuals escape dangerous situations. The community, once shaken by her tragic death, found a renewed purpose in ensuring that no other life would be lost in vain. In the end, Nicole's legacy was one of transformation. Though her life was cut short, her memory became a catalyst for change, proof that even in the darkest moments, there is light to be found. What do you think of Nicole VanderHeyden and the tragic circumstances surrounding her story? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How would you rate this story on a scale from 0 to 10? Let us know, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling true crime stories.